So I have pre-recorded my talk. I hope you won't mind my not actually moving my mouth.
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Schaffer. Thanks very much for inviting me. I have for a long time been a big fan of the NICE conferences. I'd like to describe some of the work that we have been doing on neuroevolution or evolving spiking neural networks. We think this is an approach that has enormous potential for finding really good designs. We furthermore think that the kind of task domain to focus on would be sensory motor decision tasks, or exactly the kinds of tasks that nature found it necessary to evolve brains for in the first place. We think that an important element of this approach is going to be what we call scale up. In other words, making incremental improvements in the difficulty of the task so as to hopefully induce evolution to make corresponding increases in the sophistication of the spiking neural networks that solve the task. So here's a simple toy example we've been playing with. This was first published by Fulmer and McCullin 30 years ago. It's a simple 5 by 5 Cartesian array of squares. The robot can occupy any one of them in any pointing in any of the cardinal directions. There are two objects. The objects represent kind of an assemblage of occupied squares. And there are two kinds of objects. We call them the good object and the bad object. I like to think of them as the good object being food and the bad object being poison. The robot's decision task is to basically move onto one of the occupied squares of the good object, in other words, eat it, and not to do so in the bad environment. When the objects are, as shown on the left, what we call the easy task, from almost any position that a robot encounters the object, the input stimulus patterns will be different. And so it's easy for the evolution to come up with simple stimulus response designs for the spiking neural net that solve that problem. However, when we make the good object even just a little bit more similar to the bad object, the problem becomes enormously more difficult for evolution. And we've had to do a lot of tries to get it to solve this harder version of the problem. Some of the lessons we've learned: we've got a chromosome-driven growth process for the neural network topology, and I think as there's general agreement in this community that topology is the algorithm when it comes to neural networks. How many neurons and how they're wired up determines what this computing machine can and cannot do. We have to give up some of the complexity of which spiking neural network connectomes are possible in order to make the chromosome not grow order n squared. Our current algorithm grows order n. We're pretty sure we've got some more lessons we could learn about how to do this right, and that's going to be one of the lessons that we try to draw from the experiments that we've done, looking for behavioral motifs and hopefully structural motifs that allow us to come up with a better chromosome structure. We also have played with left-right symmetry. Nature has done that quite a bit. The potential is enormous reduction in the size of the search space. We have done experiments that indicate that zero symmetry and 100% symmetry are both not what's called for. Something in between. Lessons learned there from C. elegans and Drosophila have helped us come up with a scheme for that. The fitness function is, again, part of the dark art of getting evolution to work. Right now, we're still exploring variations, but we're fond of hierarchical vector fitness. In other words, the first element of fitness to go after is to not eat the poison, and only then do you try to reduce the number of meals missed. And there are tertiary and later factors that could be added, such as doing it with low energy or doing it quickly. Crossover. Not too vigorous, not too little. Lots more to be learned there. We have made variations on the sensor information. The original sensors were what we call touch sensors. They would only tell if the square that the sensor was over was occupied or not. We decided to give it a little bit more information, what we call olfactory sensors, and that seemed to help quite a bit. Here's a winning design that has emerged. We've got the sensors over on the left side, getting spikes from the sensors, and they're arrayed in such a way that symmetry can be achieved. There are 6 excitatory neurons wired up in a very particular way, and there are 2 effectors on the right-hand side. If spikes go to both of them, the robot takes a step forward. If spikes go to only one of them, it rotates. If spikes go to neither of them, it makes no move at all and gets a repeat of the same sensory inputs on the second round. Here we show what we like to call artificial psychology approach. That is, we make tables of careful observations of the behaviors and see if we can search these behavioral patterns for patterns for behavioral motifs that might indicate computational motifs that should be very useful. The tables are, of course, too small for you to read, but the point that you can get from this is that the bad environment, being quite simple with fourfold symmetry, only requires 5 distinct behavioral sequences, whereas the good environment with more rich variety requires 31 different distinct behaviors, and we're currently looking at computational linguistics approaches like n-gram determinations, looking for some of these behavioral motifs. But unlike the behaviorists, like B.F. Skinner and company, we can actually look inside the brain of these little robots. And here we show one example that's discussed in the paper. We have candidate number 1, who does the right thing most of the time, but on 8 of the 48 trials, it actually hits the poison object. And so that's the wrong thing to do. Here's an example of one in which a spike goes to each of the wheels, and he takes a step forward because he happens to be facing the robot at the object at that time. That's the wrong thing to do. Candidate number 2 is a descendant of his, emerging several hundred generations later. There's a good 17 differences in the connectome and quite a few differences in the parameters to the network. But the difference is only one of those spikes goes to a wheel, details in the paper, and he rotates. And once he's rotated, the object is now on his left or his right side, and he's able to take steps and do the right thing. So from all of these explorations, we think we've got a pattern that we have seen. This is just a conjecture at this moment. We'd like to get stronger evidence for this. But what we see emerging is a spiking neural network that has a hardwired default behavior, which is most often used and is most often right. But there are special circuits that are triggered by special sensory input patterns that override the default behavior in certain circumstances. By way of literature references, we would point that Konrad Lorenz's famous book on aggression provides many examples of this kind of default and specialized override behaviors in animals, and more recently Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow talks about this kind of behavior in human beings. Acknowledgements, thanks very much to my good friends and colleagues at the Neuromorphic Computing Group at the Air Force Research Lab in Rome. They've been supporting me for several summers, and 3 graduate students that I list here have made seminal contributions to